What does a 12-year-old girl know of destiny? Not much. But in the 1300s, that didn't matter. By the time she could spell her name, someone else was already spelling out her future. Not in love letters, but in dowry lists. Not with poetry, but with poultry. Tonight, we slip quietly behind the curtain of history, into a world where girlhood ended at the negotiating table, where lace and livestock held more weight than dreams, and where silence wasn't just expected, it was survival. Who were these girls? What did they think, sitting still as contracts were whispered about them in another room? And how did they endure lives written in ink they never held? If you're curious, truly curious, stay with me. Dim the lights. Let the hum of the present fade, and lean into a story that was never meant to be told from her point of view. But tonight, we'll try. In the 1300s, dowries weren't a charming tradition. They were a requirement. Think of them like medieval starter kits for brides. A bundled offering meant to sweeten the deal, grease the alliance, and reassure everyone involved that the bride wouldn't arrive empty-handed. Or worse, empty-headed. A typical dowry might include livestock. Functional was always better. Maybe a few linen sheets, some chipped kitchenware, and if the family had been saving up, a tarnished necklace passed down from an aunt who claimed it was once touched by a nun. For families of modest means, dowries were exhausting to assemble. You weren't just giving away a daughter, you were transferring responsibility. And if your bundle of cloth, hens, and family reputation didn't quite meet the expectations, the entire arrangement could fall apart faster than a wool tunic too close to a flame. Among nobles, the stakes weren't just higher, they were infinitely pettier. Land, debts, influence, everything could be bartered alongside the daughter's future. Betrothals became mini diplomatic summits. A girl might be married off to secure a border, erase an unpaid loan, or win favor from a cousin's liege lord's brother-in-law, who, coincidentally, owned a river crossing. Romance rarely entered the equation. Historians still debate whether dowries functioned as a woman's early inheritance or a tool of control designed to limit her movement and tether her obligations. But one fact remains. Dowries dictated the shape of a girl's life long before she ever stood at the altar. Back in the hall, her mother adjusts her veil and glances toward her daughter. She offers a smile, the kind meant to reassure. It doesn't. Everyone in the room knows exactly what is happening, but no one says it aloud. Even the priest, standing silent near the wall with an expression hovering between neutral and mildly bored, is here more as a witness than a blessing. The church may have preached spiritual equality, but it never hesitated to legitimize a property transaction dressed in holy robes. If you think the process was all dry ritual and humorless formality, here's a detail that might catch you off guard. In some villages, the dowry included a symbolic trinket, a carved spoon, perhaps, or a single cherry stone plucked from a tree that never bore fruit again. These were tokens meant to bring luck, or mark the uniqueness of the bride. Superstition wrapped gently in sentiment. Picture it, giving your future in-laws a symbolic twig and saying, "This means our daughter cries less than most." The negotiation itself might take place over tankards of warm ale and a half-eaten loaf of rye bread. Somewhere in there, a mild argument would erupt about whether a second goose counts as generosity or shameless showboating. Through it all, the girl stays silent. By this point, her worth has been assessed more thoroughly than the family's cow. Historical records show that in many communities of the time, girls as young as 12 could be legally betrothed, and with parental consent, sometimes even married. It wasn't strange. It wasn't scandalous. It was simply Tuesday. Life expectancy in the medieval world hovered somewhere around the 40s, if you were lucky. Childhood didn't stretch far. Puberty wasn't a phase of awkward growth. It was seen more as an administrative green light. Once a match had been agreed upon, the betrothal could be marked in several ways. Sometimes it was blessed formally by the church. Other times, it was sealed by nothing more than a nod and the passing of a folded document. In rural places, the customs were even simpler. There are records of marriages being confirmed with nothing more than a handclasp in front of witnesses and a modest gift exchange. One story tells of a father finalizing his daughter's engagement by handing the groom a lit candle. Romantic, right? A burning stick as a legally binding symbol. What could possibly go wrong? Outside, the evening darkens. A breeze curls underneath the wooden threshold. Inside, the girl is handed a piece of stiff, embroidered cloth, something her aunt stitched by candlelight, eyes squinting against the flame. It will be packed with the rest of her dowry, a quiet marker of the household she is about to enter. She doesn't say a word. She simply folds it once more and places it gently in her lap. In towns, particularly those with a merchant class, matchmaking often involved intermediaries. Sometimes even convents took on the task. Nuns would arrange marriages between families who had previously feuded, turning the union into both a peace treaty and a whispered hope for stability. That the bride was now a literal olive branch. No one thought it strange. There were, of course, practical matters to resolve as well. What happened if the groom died before the wedding? Did the dowry stay with his family? Could it be legally reclaimed? These were real concerns. Legal loopholes were something of a medieval pastime. Some families even crafted contracts with detailed escape clauses. One such clause stated, if the groom were found to have lice beyond a tolerable quantity, the marriage contract could be nullified. Let that settle for a moment. You could be released from your marriage agreement on the grounds of excessive lice. Yes, medieval prenups had an impressive range. Meanwhile, the girl sits still through all of this. Her expression is calm, not because she feels calm, but because she's been trained that way. She knows exactly what's expected of her: obedience, silence, and grace. Even how she walks, how she holds a cup, how she places her hands in her lap. All of it has been rehearsed. Because in a world where your marriage is your family's best shot at survival, your posture becomes a form of currency. You might think all of this sounds transactional, and you'd be right. But within the cold mathematics of alliance and reputation, there were still moments, small and tender. A mother brushing a stray hair behind her daughter's ear. An older cousin sneaking a wink when no one was looking. A whispered joke passed beneath a raised goblet. Affection wasn't absent. It was just buried, folded under layers of duty, wrapped in obligation, and occasionally hidden beneath a pile of chickens. Later, when the hall empties and the fire burns low, the girl will be told the name of her future husband. Maybe she already knows it. Maybe he's 15 and bashful. Maybe he's 32 and owns a small orchard. Maybe she saw him once at the harvest fair and remembers nothing but the fact that he wore far too much green. Her future is no longer something she can shape. But then again, in this world, it never really was. In medieval times, age wasn't just a number. It was a deadline. By the time a girl turned 12, she was no longer a child in the eyes of her community. She was considered, quite seriously, marriage material. A phrase that today sounds like a cruel joke. But back then, it was simply truth. Girlhood had a short shelf life, especially if the family farm needed merging, or if a local alliance was ripe for the taking. In towns and villages alike, the church bells didn't only toll for holy days. They rang to announce marriage intentions, and often, they rang for girls who still hadn't figured out how to braid their own hair. No one gasped. No one whispered behind their hands. It was accepted. You may wonder how people found this acceptable. But to be fair, medieval communities had different concepts of childhood. Puberty wasn't a private moment. It was seen as nature handing out wedding invitations. And we can't overlook the church's role in this. Canon law technically allowed girls as young as 12 to marry, and boys at 14, as long as there was consent. Though consent, in this context, could mean something as thin as not crying too loudly during the ceremony. While consummation might be postponed in some cases, the contract of marriage was often sealed far earlier. Two families, two futures, locked into a deal built more for politics than for personal choice. Picture a stone church, filled with damp wool, half-suppressed coughs, and candles flickering in a cold draft. Their wax drips like nervous sweat. A priest stands at the front and reads the banns, a public announcement. Matilda, daughter of the local miller, will be married to a boy she has spoken to exactly once. He gave her a stick of dried quince at the Michaelmas fair. She didn't like quince. She will now. Out of necessity. No one asks whether she's ready to raise children, to keep a house, to balance accounts. Readiness isn't part of the equation. Biological signs and social expectation, those are the only metrics that matter. If she's tall enough to stir a pot and carry firewood, then congratulations. She is ready. Some families began preparing their daughters for betrothal the moment puberty made its first appearance. Mothers would discreetly begin letting the neighbors know that their daughters were now available. Fathers would calculate how much cloth they could spare from winter weaving to sweeten the proposal. Older women, particularly widows, played a vital role in this process. They passed on the subtle politics of presence. How to bow with just enough humility. How to speak softly, but clearly. How to smile in a way that said, modest, but fertile. And the girls, they adapted, with the kind of resilience only found in those who've never been taught they have a choice. One month they played games in the yard. The next, they tried on betrothal veils. The shift wasn't so jarring. When everyone around you treated it as the most natural thing in the world. There's a haunting detail here, one that often slips quietly through the cracks of recorded history. The concept of childhood as a protected, extended phase of life simply didn't exist. Children were considered miniature adults in training. They were expected to contribute to the household, take on responsibilities, and learn their gendered roles early. And once they were physically capable, they were expected to step fully into those roles, without question. If that sounds exhausting to us now, it was. But it was also considered entirely normal. Even girls from aristocratic families weren't exempt from these expectations. In fact, they often bore more pressure, faced more scrutiny, and were granted even less autonomy than their lower-class peers. Their marriages were arranged from birth, reshuffled and renegotiated like chess pieces on a nobleman's board, all depending on which uncle had lost favor this year, or which parcel of land needed uniting. It wasn't uncommon for a noble girl to be promised at 5, betrothed by 8, and ceremonially married by the age of 12, whether she fully understood what that meant or not. Love, as always, rarely factored into the conversation. If affection developed later, it was considered a stroke of good fortune. But more often, it didn't. One noblewoman reportedly met her husband for the first time on their wedding day. Her main observation: he had a wart on his ear and smelled very strongly of mustard. A stunning foundation for marital bliss. Historians still debate whether these young brides truly grasped what was happening to them. Some believe the girls were naive, sheltered from adult concerns, and unaware of the stakes. Others argue that children in medieval households were exposed early and regularly to adult responsibilities, that they may have known more than we give them credit for. But either way, comprehension wasn't required. Obedience was. In village streets, children mimicked the adults they saw. Young girls played house, but not in the sense of tiny tea sets or dolls. They practiced sweeping. They practiced spinning wool. They rocked imaginary babies on their hips. Their imitation of adulthood was not seen as troubling. It was considered charming. A type of preparation. Here's another fringe detail worth knowing. In some rural communities, a girl's first menstruation was quietly observed, not as a personal milestone, but as a signal to the wider community. No bells were rung, but word would spread, and suddenly, that girl's name would be spoken in new tones. Less, she helps her mother with the goats. More, she will make a fine wife, once the dowry is ready. And yes, the pressure came from all sides. A girl's worth was tightly wound to her ability to marry, and to marry well. If her family was poor, the pressure arrived with urgency. If her family was wealthy, it came with calculation. But either way, it always came. The church, ever watchful, played a double role. On one hand, it preached the importance of spiritual purity and mutual consent. On the other, it routinely blessed marriages involving girls whose consent was, at best, theoretical. One particularly infamous preacher even encouraged parents to marry off their daughters as early as possible to ward off the sin of lust, as if the only way to avoid temptation was to throw a child directly into it, head first, often with a man twice her age. Now, occasionally, a young bride might find herself in a household where she was treated with kindness. Maybe her mother-in-law welcomed her, gently taking her under her wing. Maybe her husband waited, gave her time, and kept his demands at bay. But those were exceptions, not rules. And even in those rare cases, the young bride was still expected to manage the household, to begin preparing for motherhood, to smile for the guests, especially the ones who pinched her cheeks and gave compliments like, "She'll be quite comely once she fills out." It was a lot, but the girls didn't always break under the weight of it. Some endured, some adapted. A few learned to negotiate quietly and cleverly. They wielded soft refusals. They built quiet alliances with their mothers or with servants. Others found freedom in small things. Storytelling, festivals, friendships with other girls caught in the same net. So when the church bells rang, and a pale, wide-eyed 12-year-old girl walked down the aisle in borrowed shoes, you didn't hear scandal. You didn't hear sorrow. You heard approval. You saw neighbors nod. You saw the priest smile. You saw another contract completed. Another girl reshaped to fit someone else's future. Because in the 1300s, the age of marriage wasn't a milestone. It was a finish line, and some girls were expected to reach it before they even knew how to run. And it often didn't begin with a priest, or with the girl herself. It started with a father, sometimes a neighbor, maybe a cousin, or a merchant from 2 villages away, sitting on a worn bench, talking over mugs of lukewarm ale, the air thick with the scent of barley and smoke. Conversations drifted from livestock to rainfall, and then, almost casually, into something far more consequential. So your daughter is nearly of age then? The medieval marriage market wasn't an actual market, of course, but you'd be forgiven for thinking so. It was quiet, ambient, like a low-pressure system settling over a village. It didn't arrive with ceremony. It arrived with convenience, with seasonal need, and occasionally, with boredom. The kinds of deals that shaped a young girl's life didn't begin with a contract. They began with phrases like, "Would it not be something if?" And they ended with the exchange of chickens, or a corner of land, or promises that no one truly intended to keep. While the aristocracy obsessed over bloodlines and coats of arms, the rural families made matches based on simpler metrics. Who had goats? Who had grain? And who had too many mouths to feed? Marriage, in that world, could solve problems before they even took shape. Too many sons on one farm? Marry one off, and send him away. Too few daughters to cook the barley and churn the butter? Better get one from just down the lane. It's easy to imagine these kinds of arrangements as cold, even heartless. But they weren't always. There was care in them. The same sort of care a carpenter might show when smoothing the edges of a stool he's about to sell. The girl's father wasn't necessarily cruel. He was pragmatic. If the roof leaked, if the cow limped, if the thatch needed replacing before the frost, then his daughter's marriage might be the only solution that made sense. In a world where certainty was rare and security even rarer, a good marriage deal was the closest thing to stability you could hope for. The terms of the match might be discussed over several days, with breaks for church, bread, and plenty of ale. Each family tried to appear generous, but also weighed down by duty. The girl's family might mention, softly but clearly, she's a quiet girl. She churns butter well. She sings psalms and never complains. The boy's side might respond, modestly, that while he isn't the handsomest lad, he does own 3 pairs of boots. And really, isn't that more useful than charm? Negotiations like these were rarely just about the couple themselves. They were about the families, the alliances, the benefits. A marriage could mean shared grain during a poor season, or access to a well, or even the joint ownership of one especially plump sow. And if the groom's cousin had once insulted the bride's uncle at a previous festival, well, now they'd have to sit together at the wedding feast, pretending they'd never tried to poison each other's stew. Meanwhile, younger daughters would listen in from behind doors, or peer through the slats in the loft. They learned early that their future would be decided at these tables. They recognized the subtle shift in their father's voice, the look that said, without saying, "You'll wear the blue dress tomorrow." Sometimes, they even smiled politely at the visitor in question, nodded on cue, practicing courtesy like it was a second language. And when the guest left, they would stare at the bench where he had been seated, wondering, silently, whether they were supposed to feel anything at all. Historians still debate whether peasant girls had more agency in marriage than noble daughters. Some argue the lower classes allowed for more familiarity, more room to marry someone you already knew. Others point out that when survival is on the line, personal preference gets bulldozed. A farmer can dismiss a girl's opinion just as easily as a king. In the end, consent was often assumed, not asked for. And that brings us to one of the quieter, but more brutal truths of the medieval marriage market. Once the fathers had agreed, over ale, bread, or the punchline of a shared joke, the match might as well have been carved in stone. The girl would be informed. She would be dressed appropriately, and expected to behave with humility and, ideally, enthusiasm. If she was lucky, the match would be with someone close to her own age. Maybe someone she'd seen around the village once or twice. If she was less lucky, it could be an older widower, looking for a second wife to raise his children, children who might be just a few years younger than she was. And if she was very unlucky, the groom might be a man her father owed a favor to, a match arranged not to build a future, but to cancel a debt. There are recorded cases of girls refusing outright, but that kind of defiance came at a cost. A daughter who resisted too loudly might be labeled difficult, or prideful, or touched. In some villages, even a single failed betrothal could stain a girl's reputation. Whispers would follow her to market, and future prospects would vanish like fog under morning sun. Still, not every match was bleak. Some couples grew fond of each other. They shared jokes, developed rhythms. A husband might carve his wife a wooden comb, or surprise her with the first egg from the hens. Affection wasn't impossible. It just wasn't required. And when it did blossom after marriage, it was considered a small miracle, like a warm spring after a particularly cruel winter. If the girl cried, that wasn't necessarily interpreted as resistance. Tears were common, dismissed as nerves, or excitement, or just typical female fragility. A girl could be quietly weeping into her sleeve and still be praised for her composure, as long as she stood where she was told and didn't drop the ceremonial loaf of bread. Her performance, in many ways, was as much a part of the agreement as the livestock. She was expected to be modest, but not dull, quiet, but not completely mute, pleasing, but never provocative. She was a mirror of her family's honor, and every crease in her dress, every loose pin in her hair, reflected back on the people who raised her. The groom's family, meanwhile, conducted their inspection with the solemnity of merchants evaluating a plow. Was she healthy? Did she have broad hips? Clear skin? No limp? Could she lift a bucket without stumbling? Was her laugh too sharp? Too sly? A little wit was acceptable, even charming. But too much wit meant trouble. No one wanted to marry a girl who might argue about how many geese belonged in the barn. Some records even mention a peculiar clause, that the bride should not bring bad dreams or unlucky smells into the household. What this meant, spiritual omen or digestive history, is unclear, but the fear of misfortune was always close. The economics of marriage bled into every part of the process. A father might exaggerate his daughter's dowry to boost her appeal. "She'll come with 2 goats and half an acre," he might say, neglecting to mention that one goat was blind and the acre flooded every spring. The groom's father, of course, would respond in kind. He might boast about his son's future inheritance, carefully skipping over the fact that the land in question belonged to the abbey and was covered in nettles. Everyone played along. Everyone pretended the promises were solid. No one mentioned famine, or plague, or the possibility of a failed barley harvest. Weddings were brief pockets of optimism, wrapped in music, food, and mutual deceit. And when the day arrived, the bride would step forward toward her new life, wearing shoes she barely recognized, beside a man whose name she had only recently learned to spell. That night, after the hall had emptied, and the guests had stumbled home, her father would sit with his ale. He'd exhale slowly. One more daughter matched, one more burden lifted, one more agreement sealed, not with ink, but with bread, boots, and the quiet, irreversible sound of expectations falling neatly into place. Inside monasteries that smelled of wax and damp stone, other kinds of arrangements were being made. Behind thick walls and arched ceilings, monks and clerics didn't just copy manuscripts or recite prayers. They also negotiated marriages, not for themselves, of course, but for noble families who entrusted them with discretion, with strategy, and most of all, with silence. In the 1300s, many aristocrats turned to monastic institutions for matchmaking. These were not matters of romance. They were calculations, executed with quill and ink, bloodlines traced in narrow margins of old parchment, alliances arranged like pieces in a territorial puzzle. A monk with access to the right family trees and a timely awareness of who had recently died could secure the future of a girl he had never even met, all before breakfast. One might picture monks as detached from worldly matters, but the truth was far more layered. Many of them were born into noble households themselves. They understood the delicate balance of inheritance, alliances, and family reputation. They served not merely as scribes or spiritual guides, but as intermediaries, brokers of lineage and virtue, filtering through marriage candidates with the weary precision of someone selecting the least bruised apple in a basket already too ripe. Monasteries were more than places of prayer. They were archives, holding records of births, baptisms, deaths, and previous betrothals, the quiet details that could make or break a proposed union. If a girl had once been promised to a cousin who tragically drowned in a pond, it was the monks who remembered. If a boy's aunt had once flirted with heresy, the monks quietly noted it. Reputation mattered, and the church kept the receipts. These negotiations were usually cloaked in confidentiality. Families submitted names and assets through trusted messengers or discreet clerics. Sometimes, talks stretched over weeks. Other times, they concluded in a single letter, urgency often dictated by proximity to a war or scandal. One such case saw a monastery help broker a marriage between two second cousins, simply to consolidate ownership of a vineyard that both families believed they held claim to. The bride, reportedly, was more delighted by the wine than by the groom. And monks weren't the only ecclesiastical matchmakers. Abbesses, especially those in powerful convents, held significant influence as well. Many noble daughters were sent to nunneries before marriage, not out of devotion to religious life, but as a temporary, respectable holding pattern, a waiting room for girlhood. While residing there, these young women were taught Latin prayers, proper table manners, embroidery, and, most importantly, how to remain silent in the presence of authority. Occasionally, they also met sons of local lords during feast days or supervised visits. And if a glance lingered just a moment too long, someone took note. Some marriages began from these brief, orchestrated interactions. Others were arranged long before either party had even reached puberty. The church, with all its elaborate bureaucracy, played matchmaker, lawyer, and judge. Priests ensured that the couple wasn't too closely related, at least on paper. Though too close was flexible. Cousins marrying cousins wasn't just common. Sometimes it was preferred. The important thing was that everyone involved agreed to pretend the math worked out. If a marriage needed to be expedited, whether due to inheritance, illness, or looming scandal, the church could issue a dispensation. One papal document allowed a nobleman to marry his cousin's widow with incredible speed, provided he donated a generous portion of land to a nearby abbey. The abbey later used the land to build a new granary. The widow, as rumor has it, used that granary as a private retreat whenever her new husband became irritating. In some cases, church officials became unintentionally entangled in the emotional weight of these unions. Letters from abbots express concerns over reluctant brides or grooms with reputations for excessive drinking. These concerns were usually filed politely and then ignored, but their existence in the records tells us something. Not everyone was blind to the human cost behind these contracts. The church also walked a strange, often contradictory line when it came to consent. Technically, marriage required mutual agreement. The bride and groom both had to say yes, but that yes could be whispered in a field, overheard by a shepherd, and later recited under oath, and it would still count. A nod could carry the same legal weight as a vow, as long as the right people witnessed it. Historians still debate whether this flexibility was meant to protect young lovers, or simply to make paperwork easier. For girls living in convents, the transition from potential nun to promised bride could be sudden. 1 week, they were learning to illuminate psalms. The next, they were being measured for a wedding gown. There was rarely any warning. A letter arrived. The match was approved. Preparations began. Some girls left quietly. Others sobbed into the stone walls and left claw marks in their wooden trunks. Both reactions were considered acceptable. Some convents permitted the girls one final walk through the garden before departure. These weren't lush, Edenic sanctuaries. Just small herb patches, rosemary, sage, maybe a crooked bench carved like a coffin lid. Still, they offered a final moment. A breath. A goodbye, not just to silence and discipline, but to the illusion of choice. Because once the marriage contract was sealed, there was no return. Not unless scandal intervened. Or death. After the match was finalized, the convent might host a small transitional ceremony. The girl would be gifted a new veil, a different ribbon, or a ring from the family she was about to join. These gestures were subtle, but symbolic. They marked the death of one identity and the beginning of another. From novice to noblewoman, from daughter to asset, From girl to wife, there was often one quiet moment, no more than a breath, when the bride would walk the corridors of the convent one last time. Perhaps she paused at the chapel. Perhaps she turned to look back at the bed where she once whispered her fears to another girl, long past curfew. These departures weren't dramatic. There was no slamming of doors, no shouting in defiance, only the hush of soft shoes across cold stone, and the undeniable weight of a door closing behind her, for good. In towns and cities, monks and abbesses sometimes played another role, that of chaperone. They supervised the rare meetings between betrothed couples. But these were not romantic encounters. The boy would sit stiffly beside the girl. A monk might ask questions about grain yields or feast days on the church calendar. If anyone blushed, it was blamed on the weather. And yet, even in these arranged, regulated, almost clinical moments, something human occasionally sparked. A small laugh, a timid glance, a mutual dislike for the fish stew served in the priory kitchen. It wasn't much, but for two people about to be locked into a lifelong agreement, even something that small was better than nothing. In rural communities where convents or monastic networks were distant or non-existent, priests still played a role in matchmaking, often under subtle, pressing demands. A local father might consult the priest, not to seek divine guidance, but to ensure that his daughter's potential suitor wasn't part of a long-standing feud with the neighboring family. The priest's job was less about scripture and more about social investigation, which meant wandering fields, muttering half-remembered psalms, and collecting gossip. There are actual records of marriages being delayed because a priest refused to officiate until a dispute over a missing pig had been resolved. At other times, the church simply looked the other way. As long as the marriage didn't threaten the social hierarchy, interfere with the tithe, or disrupt the illusion of divine order, it was permitted to proceed. Once the church had done its part, confirmed the match, filed the papers, and blessed the intention, it stepped aside. The marriage itself now belonged to the families. Yes, the priest would be present. He would stand at the front and mumble Latin that no one in the room fully understood. But his true role ended the moment the couple clasped hands. From that point forward, the bride was no longer under ecclesiastical protection. She was under her husband's roof, his rule, and if he was particularly devout, his personal interpretation of divine authority. It's tempting to imagine the monks and abbesses closing their ledgers and breathing out a quiet sigh of relief. One more match made, one more girl placed, one more box ticked on a chart of order, balance, and the illusion of holy harmony. But perhaps, just once in a while, one of them might have paused at the chapel window, might have watched the girl riding away beneath the weight of her wedding veil, and wondered, however briefly, what might have happened if she had stayed. She wears silk, or something that looks like silk. It's stiff at the shoulders and pulls tight beneath her arms. Her sleeves are stuffed with dried lavender to mask the scent of fear, and her shoes are wrapped in cloth to keep the mud from seeping through. She is a noble daughter, and she is not walking. She is being walked, escorted through corridors of expectations, down staircases carved by hands so old their names have been forgotten. Somewhere below, a horse waits. Somewhere further still, a man she has never met is preparing for her arrival. Among the nobility, marriage was not simply a union. It was strategy. It was diplomacy. It was a transaction sewn into velvet and stitched with land rights. The daughters of powerful families were traded with the same solemn care one might reserve for battle maps or royal seals. If she was beautiful, all the better. If she was clever, that might be useful. And if she was difficult, well, someone would find a way to manage that. Her future had already been discussed months ago, maybe even years. Perhaps it was brought up openly when she turned 10, or perhaps it had been decided while she was still in her cradle. Marriage arrangements among noble houses were mapped out generations in advance, drawn across parchments by men with ink-stained fingers and long, unforgiving memories. Her name wasn't truly her own. It was a thread, woven into a web of loyalty, politics, and sometimes revenge. The marriage of a noble girl often meant traveling across great distances. It wasn't uncommon for her to be sent hundreds of miles away, to a man whose only claim to familiarity was a family crest carved into a corner of some forgotten tapestry. She might speak a different dialect than her new family. She might only know one thing about her future husband, that he walks with a limp, or collects glass birds. or once rode into battle with his hair on fire. The truth, she'll learn soon enough. The process of her departure is ceremonial. Servants pack her trunks with embroidered cloths and folded gowns, stitched by cousins she will likely never see again. Her dowry is read aloud, signed by notaries, stamped by uncles. The list is not romantic. 3 dozen pewter plates, 2 kettles, a side table with 1 broken leg, a set of bone combs. This is her trousseau, not just her belongings, but her defense, her calling card, her proof that she came from a house worth respecting. Sometimes there is jewelry, not for sentiment, but for signaling. A clasp from a long-dead grandmother. A ring with Latin words no one really remembers how to translate. These were tools, not gifts. Symbols that warned, she comes from lineage. If something happens to her, someone will notice. The household staff stands in 2 lines as she leaves. Some weep, others whisper. Will the roads be passable? Will her escort behave? Will the new lord be kind, or just quiet enough to pass as such? She is expected to remain composed. Noble daughters are trained for this moment. From age 7, she's practiced curtsies in front of the mirror. By 10, she has learned to answer questions without revealing emotion. By 12, she has been told, again and again, that her destiny is far too important to waste on something as frivolous as personal desire. And so she rides, through forests that look like fables, across bridges that groan under the weight of her name. Sometimes the journey takes days, sometimes weeks. Sometimes she is accompanied by ladies-in-waiting, chosen for their ability to stay calm under pressure, and to carry bedrolls without complaint. Other times, she travels almost alone, guarded by men sworn to protect her, and wielding swords far shinier than their intentions. The weather rarely cooperates. Rain turns roads to rivers. Horses stumble in darkness. Campfires sputter in wind. She often rides in silence, her face frozen from cold, her hands wrapped in cloth. There are accounts of noble brides arriving with frost-bitten toes, their boots too tight, their servants too frightened to stop and fix them. When she arrives, there is no grand celebration. The gates creak open. She is led down corridors filled with strangers. Her husband may be there, or he may be off hunting, deer, or courtly favor. His mother may greet her, her smile too tight, the wine too warm. She is shown to her chamber. The door closes. She has arrived. Often, noble brides bring letters of introduction, sealed scrolls from her family to his. They contain nothing surprising, only duty, unity, and the promise of sons. They never mention fear. They never ask whether she's sleeping. They don't need to. Among the elite, marriage was less about partnership and more about performance. The household watches her. Does she wake early? Does she speak too quickly? Does she treat the servants with dignity or with disdain? Every gesture becomes part of a portrait she does not get to paint. She is both the canvas and the artist, held responsible for every brushstroke that is not hers to choose. Historians say noble marriages were often colder than their peasant counterparts. Noble marriages were colder. There was simply more at stake: land, power, bloodlines, and that left far less room for affection. Love wasn't just unnecessary. It was dangerous, a liability that could disrupt negotiations or complicate inheritance. That said, exceptions existed. Occasionally, fondness emerged. Slowly, gently, fed by mutual respect and the quiet weariness of courtly routine. But most of the time, noble girls were woven into their new households like fresh cloth sewn into an aging tunic. They were expected to match the pattern and not complain when the seams scratched. Sometimes, a bride would discover her new husband was kind. Sometimes, she would find he was cruel. And sometimes, he was simply gone. Physically present, but emotionally unreachable, like the falcon kept tethered in the family muse. In those cases, she learned to move like mist through the manor, silent, soft, and unseen. In homes with multiple wives, from remarriage or older family arrangements, tension simmered. The senior wife might view the newcomer as a threat, regardless of how young or naive she was. The younger wife, meanwhile, learned to smile without showing her teeth. Her role was clearly defined: produce heirs, maintain the estate, uphold appearances. The household priest might remind her that her womb belonged to God and her time to her husband. She would nod, though neither statement ever felt quite true. Her education didn't end with the wedding. It continued behind closed doors and whispered conversations. She learned which maids could be trusted, which doors squeaked in the night, and which people truly held power, regardless of titles. In many households, the steward wielded more control than the lord, and one poorly chosen word in the kitchen could echo through the entire estate by evening. Letters sent home were composed carefully. "The house is large" could mean anything from "the walls are cold" to "I do not belong here." "He is often away" might be fact or permission. Her mother would read the letter, fold it into her lap, and say nothing at all. Some noble brides formed quiet rebellions. They hosted poetry readings, listened to wandering musicians, kept journals hidden beneath mattress straw. These were not protests. They were survival. Small flames lit in places too narrow for wind. The expectation of children arrived swiftly. If no pregnancy came within the year, whispers began. The fault, of course, was always hers. She might be advised to eat figs, bathe in goat's milk, or sleep with rosemary tucked beneath her pillow. If none of that worked, prayers would follow. And if prayers failed, sympathy would curdle into disappointment. When a child finally arrived, preferably loud and male, there was celebration. But it was brief. The next morning, the house returned to its routine, and the mother added one more mouth to her list of responsibilities. The noble daughter, who once trembled beneath her father's gate, now stood beside her own. She had become matron, guardian of the keys, the voice of instruction. Her sleeves no longer smelled of lavender. Her shoes were worn. Her words were measured. She gave advice to younger girls, remembering all too well what it felt like to arrive with too many expectations and too few answers. She had learned, as so many did, that marriage among the elite was not a prize. It was not a romance. It wasn't even a true partnership. It was a role, performed without applause, written by fathers, priests, and cures in ink that never quite dried. Somewhere, beyond a walled courtyard, beneath ivy leaves and the murmur of gossiping maids, two figures exchange glances. They are not supposed to. She is promised. He is unpromised, which is part of the problem. No letter has passed between their families. No dowry has been weighed. No priest has rehearsed their names. And still, their eyes meet. Because for all the rigid choreography of the medieval marriage market, love did exist. It wasn't absent, just inconvenient. Among the upper classes, romantic affection was viewed with suspicion, like a fever that threatened to burn down the whole estate. Marriage was a contract, a binding of names and assets. Love was a distraction, a game for poets, for fools, for those privileged enough to risk ruin. And still it happened. In hedgerows, behind chapel doors, during midsummer festivals where masks hid everything but longing. Records tell of couples who fell in love before marriage, who whispered secrets beneath trees older than their bloodlines. Some tried to run, to elope, to forge their own fate, and when they were caught, and most were, punishment followed. A noble daughter who defied her family could lose her inheritance, her status, her freedom. One case describes a girl who ran off with a stable hand. Her father found her 2 weeks later. He cut off her hair and locked her inside a convent. She later married a cousin, her choice, but only after his family paid dearly to hush the scandal. Another tale tells of a baron's daughter who fell for a younger son from a rival house. Their letters, written in Latin to avoid detection, were discovered by a housemaid and burned. The girl was married off the following month to a merchant 40 years older. The boy took vows and became a priest. Love among the nobility was a hazard. Among the poor, it was a different kind of gamble. In rural towns, affection sometimes played a small role in matchmaking. A daughter might be allowed to marry the boy she liked, so long as his family had grain, goats, and no unpaid debts. They might be permitted to speak under watchful eyes, to dance at festivals, to exchange tokens during harvest. But even there, strategy lingered. A girl might fall for the thatcher's son, but if her father had promised her to the cooper's apprentice, feelings didn't matter. She was expected to forget, and many did, or at least they tried. Love wasn't seen as a stable foundation. It faded. It distracted. It made girls reject suitable offers because they liked someone who smelled of ash and slouched when he walked. Parents were wary of it. The church was cautious. Society didn't quite know what to do with love unless it fit inside a poem. And still, it persisted. Behind market stalls, between hay bales, beside hearths glowing low in the evening, a glance would turn into a smile. A smile into a word into a promise, whispered too quickly in too quiet a place. These moments carried weight. They carried risk. Because the church did recognize a thing called clandestine marriage. A verbal agreement, exchanged in secret, with no witnesses technically. This could be legally binding, spiritually, emotionally as well. But if the families disapproved, the consequences could be dire. Historians still debate whether the church's recognition of secret marriages was a protective gesture, an effort to safeguard genuine love, or a mechanism designed to trap impulsive young couples in commitments they barely understood. In some regions, girls cleverly used this loophole to their benefit, secretly pledging themselves to a partner they preferred and then leveraging that bond to force their families into acceptance. Elsewhere, however, the very same rule was turned against them, used to coerce young women into unions with men they hardly knew, based on little more than a misunderstood promise. Stories abound of those who tried to outsmart the system. Some succeeded, slipping through its cracks. Others failed, spectacularly. One girl pretended to be married to a soldier, hoping the claim would spare her from being sent to a monastery. But when the soldier eventually returned and denied any connection to her, she was publicly humiliated, then quietly married off to a man with only one tooth and 3 daughters from a previous marriage. Her journal still survives, filled with poems of longing, loss, and garlic. Among the merchant class, where reputation held nearly equal weight as lineage, love was cautiously tolerated, in carefully measured doses. Courting was allowed but supervised. Letters might be exchanged, but often were read aloud before family members. Families orchestrated coincidental encounters during festivals or church services, offering the illusion of spontaneity while ensuring everything remained firmly under their control. Love songs written in the vernacular language were passed between households like smuggled treats, offering fleeting glimpses of yearning beneath the heavy structures of propriety. "I would trade your father's orchard for a look," one ballad read. "I would wear your name before your ring." These weren't declarations meant to shake the world. They were sighs, wrapped in rhyme, quiet acknowledgments that even in the most rigid of systems, the heart sometimes stirred. Troubadours and minstrels thrived on this quiet resistance. They roamed from court to court, singing of forbidden love, of knights who defied kings for the gift of a glance, of ladies who wept into stone fountains over choices made by others. Their songs offered catharsis, a fantasy, an imagined world where love triumphed, if only for the span of a melody. And the irony? Often the very people commissioning these performances were the ones enforcing the very marriages that brought their daughters to tears. A baron might pay a singer to recount the tragic tale of a runaway bride, only to return home and inform his own daughter that she would marry her cousin from the northern estate, whether she agreed or not. In rare moments, love and duty converged. 2 families might come to terms, and their children might, by some quiet miracle, feel something beyond obligation. Such marriages were celebrated with sincere joy. Songs were sung, cakes were baked. People whispered that God's will had been made evident. But these were the exceptions, not the norm. For most medieval girls, especially those born into noble or merchant families, love was not something that accompanied marriage. If it arrived, it often came later, slowly growing after the vows were spoken, shaped by daily routines and quiet endurance. Or it might remain no more than a faint ember, glowing gently in letters never sent, in names never spoken aloud. Even among those who married young and bore children soon after, there were still flickers of quiet rebellion. A glance held a moment too long at a night, a daydream woven into the threads of cloth, a story murmured to a maid about what might have been. These were the subtle luxuries afforded to women who were granted so few. And so, within the intricate machinery of the medieval marriage market, love persisted. Uninvited, inconvenient, often catastrophic, and nearly impossible to forget. It threaded itself through the seams of contracts, whispered from balconies, and danced barefoot across cold stone floors. Not because it was allowed, but because it refused to vanish. The room grows silent. Only the soft rustle of fabric and the scrape of a pen against parchment remain. A servant folds a letter, seals it with wax, and presses down the family crest, a symbol the bride has yet to memorize. Outside, a horse waits, not for her, but for the message confirming her presence, her obedience, her delivery. In many marriages of the 1300s, the bride arrived before the groom. Marriage by proxy was not uncommon, especially among the nobility. Travel, war, or politics often made physical presence impractical. As long as the documents were signed and the blessings secured, a young girl could be married to a man she had never even seen. In his place, a stand-in would appear at the altar, typically another nobleman or trusted family figure, reciting vows on the absent groom's behalf. The bride's response, when given, was not always hers. The stand-in might wear a ring. He might bow respectfully. He might even look apologetic, but never too much so. This, after all, was tradition. Marriage was first and foremost a transaction, not a relationship. The body was not required for the contract to be deemed valid. Historians note that proxy marriages often served strategic purposes. If a nobleman was away, negotiating, waging war, or simply avoiding the ceremony, a proxy allowed the alliance to move forward without delay. The bride's family was expected to accept this arrangement with grace, because what truly mattered was not the ceremony itself, but the union it secured. Records remain of brides who laid eyes on their husbands for the very first time. Weeks, sometimes even months, could pass after the legal union had been sealed. One young woman was wed by proxy to a man stationed at a distant garrison. When he eventually returned, he mistook her for a servant and asked where the wine was stored. She reportedly gave him the wrong answer on purpose. In other instances, portraits stood in place of the actual groom. A meticulously painted likeness, on wood, vellum, or occasionally fabric, would be sent in advance. The bride would be shown the image, offered a brief explanation, and instructed to begin her preparations. The accuracy of these portraits was unpredictable. Some were idealized. Others were pure fiction. One Italian noblewoman famously fainted upon meeting her husband. She had expected a man with auburn hair and gentle eyes, but was instead greeted by a bald knight with a scar slicing across his jaw and a habit of shouting. These portraits were not merely decorative. They served as emotional placeholders, designed to reassure or at least to postpone anxiety. "This is the man you will marry," a father might say, pointing to a tiny 2-inch painting. "He seems reasonable." And the girl might nod, silently wondering what she could possibly learn from such a small, unfamiliar face. Painted, perhaps, by someone who had never met the man at all. In some regions, these representations were formalized further. Miniatures and symbolic tokens became standard practice. A ring, a glove, or a lace-trimmed kerchief might be delivered as a proxy for the groom. The bride would wear it openly, keep it close, and sleep with it beneath her pillow. This was not a gesture of affection, it was a mark of evidence. Often, a second ceremony, called a ratification, would follow the initial proxy marriage. This time, the groom would be physically present, but even that event could feel surreal. The legal bond had already been established. The bride was already a wife. The man now standing beside her, possibly seen for the first time on that very day, was not a suitor. He was her husband. His name had already replaced hers in legal records. His coat of arms had already been embroidered into the edges of her household linens. And sometimes, the proxy arrangement was just the beginning of a prolonged absence. In remote border territories, or during times of war, the groom might not return for years. A young girl could cross into womanhood, bear children, run an estate, without ever having shared a hearth with the man whose name she carried. Letters served as their connection. Updates were short and formal. The weather is favorable. The estate yields remain modest. There was no mention of longing, no space permitted for loneliness. Some brides became widows before their husbands ever set foot near them. A sword to the ribs, a fever during a siege, a ship lost to the sea. And yet, in every legal sense, the marriage remained valid. The girl was a widow, even if she had never shared a meal or a bed with the man she was bound to. Depending on the specifics of the arrangement, she might be sent back to her family, or remain within her husband's household. If her dowry had been generous, she might retain a portion of it. If not, she returned with nothing but the title and the memory of a name she had barely spoken. Not all proxy marriages were solemn. Some had moments of strange levity. A monk once stood in for a groom and stumbled over the vows, accidentally marrying himself to the bride. It took 3 bishops, 5 days, and a strategically timed donation to set the record straight. The bride later said she preferred the monk's conversation, but accepted her fate with an amused grace. In rural areas, proxy marriages were less common, but not unheard of. A groom working in another town might send a brother or cousin to take his place, as long as the man could present written letters and a convincing likeness. The bride's family would usually agree, if he arrived bearing wine and bread for the ceremony. All the better. These unions were rarely romantic, but they were practical. In a world where travel was perilous, communication slow, and alliances held greater value than introductions, marriage by proxy kept the machinery of society moving forward. As for feelings, those came later, if they came at all. Some women adapted swiftly. They received their husbands with grace, listened carefully, and learned to pace their lives beside a man who had, until recently, been just ink on parchment. Others found the transition harder. In letters stored within family archives pinned in precise, cautious script, they wrote to mothers, sisters, or even confessors. They spoke of confusion, of unmet expectations, and in some cases, of quiet sorrow. She had imagined someone taller, someone gentler, someone more awake during dinner. She had expected to feel something, belonging, perhaps, or at least gratitude. Instead, she felt nothing but a silent ache. These feelings were rarely spoken aloud, but they crept into the margins of cookbooks, into recipes overloaded with nutmeg. They hummed through lullabies sung with trembling voices. Still, life moved forward. Fields had to be tended. Lineage had to persist. The marriage remained, etched into legal volumes rarely opened again unless there was a dispute over inheritance. And so, the girl, no longer a girl, but not quite a woman, adjusted. She learned to speak her husband's dialect. She memorized which topics to avoid. She taught herself how to sleep beside a man who breathed heavily and did not always dream kindly. Marriage by proxy, by portrait, by symbol, by necessity. In the end, it all led to the same threshold. A woman stepping into a life she had not chosen, binding herself to a man. She had not met him, and yet she was expected, somehow, to make this story her own. She holds a shoe in her hand, not to wear, but to offer. Across the room, her betrothed shifts uneasily, nervously clutching a belt that once belonged to his late uncle. Between them stands a priest, squinting at a weathered manuscript, mumbling Latin under his breath. It is a wedding ceremony, though it may not appear so. There are no flower petals strewn, no swelling music to stir emotion. Only the scent of wax, wool, and tightly held breath. The symbols will do the work. In the 1300s, marriage ceremonies were often a blend of the sacred and the symbolic. The church provided structure, rites, and the solemn approval of God. But it was the people who brought meaning. A ring might be exchanged, or it might not. A shoe, a belt, a single coin, or a jug of ale. Any of these could serve as tokens of union. It depended on the region, the family, and the means available. There was no singular script, no fixed sequence of gestures. What mattered most was intention, that it was witnessed, that something, anything symbolic passed between bride and groom. This gesture marked a turning point. It sealed a vow, and the objects used ranged from refined to curious. The ring, now seen as essential, wasn't always expected. Gold was rare and costly. Silver, though more accessible, was still reserved for the upper class. Among rural folk, a simple loop of braided hair, a piece of carved bone, or even twisted straw might stand in its place. The metal mattered less than the message. A ring stood for continuity, for unity, for the unbroken shape of a commitment. Or, at the very least, for a public reminder that the girl was no longer available. In some European regions, the bride would hand the groom a shoe, symbolizing the transfer of authority. Elsewhere, the groom would offer a belt or girdle to mark the beginning of shared life. These were not romantic gestures. They were everyday objects, elevated into ritual, a reflection of domestic labor, of obligation, of bodily presence. Other customs also shaped the ritual. The lighting of 2 candles from one flame, the binding of hands with bright ribbons, the breaking of bread, the sharing of ale from a single cup. Each act reinforced the joining of not just 2 individuals, but of 2 households, 2 families, 2 futures, all collapsing into a single, often uneasy, present. Some ceremonies were held in churches with full ecclesiastical pomp, a weary priest struggling to recall which part came next. Others unfolded outdoors, in courtyards, on staircases, or even in fields between properties. Neutral ground where both sides could gather and quietly argue about sheep while pretending to observe the vows. Historians note that the setting mattered far less than the clarity of the act. If the couple exchanged vows in public, before witnesses, and with understandable intention, the marriage was considered valid. Even the church, though eager to oversee and regulate, often allowed for local improvisation. What it cared about, in the end, was order. If the community saw the couple as wed, the church could grant its blessing after the fact. In certain places, there was a peculiar tradition. The bride carried salt in her pocket during the ceremony. The reason is still debated. Some say it symbolized preservation. Others believed it warded off spirits. One cynical chronicler wrote that it simply helped flavor the food. Since the feast often lacked seasoning, whatever the truth, it was mentioned in more than a few marriage contracts. The vows themselves were often remarkably simple. I take thee, or I will have thee. Sometimes that was enough, especially if spoken in the local tongue. Many brides were coached ahead of time, reciting the words like a child memorizing a prayer. Some spoke clearly, others mumbled. Some had to be prompted word by word. As for the groom, he was expected to be audible and composed. Too much smiling could be seen as mockery, too little as hesitance. There was a narrow middle path to walk. Among the nobility, ceremonies could grow elaborate. Multiple priests, choirs, banners waving in the wind, pages announcing the bride's lineage aloud. But even there, symbols reigned. The exchange of crests, the lifting of a veil, the deliberate step across a threshold. A noble bride might kneel before her husband. In some households, she would receive a symbolic key, granting her command over the domestic realm, or at least the illusion of it. If there was music, it was played on simple instruments, lutes, pipes, or small drums. The melodies were repetitive, easy to learn, so that even the inebriated could sing along. Fragments of the lyrics still survive. They speak of unreturned love, of dutiful unions, of cautious hope, wrapped carefully in rhyme. Gifts were part of the occasion, but they weren't always pleasant. A bride might be given a brooch, a comb, or a small tapestry. She might also receive a goat, a butter churn, or, in one peculiar account, a large wooden spoon shaped like a fish. Its meaning is unknown, but it was said to be carved with remarkable detail. Feasts followed, when possible. Even the poorest families shared what they could: bread, onions, and homemade cider. Among the wealthy, the tables groaned beneath roasted birds, fruit pies, and spiced wines. Yet no matter the extravagance, the feast was never the end. It was the beginning. The curtain had closed. The marriage had begun. Guests would trickle away. Candles burned lower, and the couple was expected to consummate the union. This, too, had its rituals. In noble houses, witnesses were sometimes appointed to wait nearby. Not quite visible, but close enough to confirm what had occurred. Beds were examined the next morning. Sheets were inspected. Rumors were whispered. If there was no blood, suspicion stirred. If the sounds were too loud, people politely looked the other way. In rural homes, the practice was less formal, but the expectation remained. The community had seen the vows. Now they expected results. A child, within a year. A visible sign that the promise had been fulfilled. There was little space for delay. And yet, despite all this pressure, the ceremonies remained deeply, unmistakably human. There were awkward silences, nervous laughter, a ribbon tied the wrong way, a candle that wouldn't stay lit, a groom who, at the worst moment, forgot. Amid the solemnity of marriage rituals, small human moments lingered. A groom fumbled, unsure which hand held the ring. A bride sneezed mid-vow, her voice breaking the sacred hush. These fleeting details, rarely etched in chronicles, lived in memory. They were the true stories, shared with chuckles at village gatherings. The ceremonies were steeped in symbolism, but the people were raw, flawed, fearful, yet hopeful. They stood in ill-fitting shoes, reciting words they scarcely grasped. They clasped hands with strangers, now bound to trust them. Through the oddity, the unease, and the grandeur, a life took root, not perfect, often not joyful, but a life nonetheless. In a field where tall grass swayed under a gentle breeze, no altar stood. No candles flickered, no finely dressed witnesses gathered, no priest chanted Latin. Two young souls stood, voices low, eyes fixed more on the earth than each other. No ring gleamed, no scroll bore their names. Yet, if they spoke the right words, in the right way, at the right moment, it would hold weight. The medieval church preached rules, but reality was messier. Canon law declared marriage a sacrament, demanding free consent from both. In theory, this was forward-thinking. A woman's agreement mattered, as did a man's. But what counted as consent was a tangled question, shifting with place, class, and literacy. Could a whisper suffice? Could consent, once given, be undone? If two claimed a private union with no witnesses, must the church accept their word? The system was rigid yet porous, demanding order while brimming with exceptions. Couples swore vows in barns, by wells, in woods, during feasts or harvest revels. Some were believed, others punished, their words left dangling, neither fully valid nor wholly rejected. This grayness birthed what scholars call clandestine marriages. Two people, in private, declared themselves wed, spontaneous, often fervent. They tried to live as husband and wife, daring the world to challenge them. When questioned, they stood firm, insisting their vows were exchanged. If pressed, they might scramble to prove it. Court records brim with such tales, a woman swearing she pledged herself in an orchard, a man claiming his neighbor's daughter vowed by a well. Some had allies, servants, shepherds, or prying kin to back their story. Others stood alone, their claims unprovable, unresolved. The church held a paradox. It honored mutual consent as sacred, yet punished those who dared act without witnesses or rights. Marriage was both intimate and public, holy yet dissected. The boundary between a lawful bond and a scandalous error was razor-thin. Communities wove their own customs to navigate this. A vow before family carried more weight than one whispered behind a barn. A promise in daylight outshone one made beneath stars. Some villages demanded the union be proclaimed 3 Sundays in a row at Mass, the banns of marriage. If no objections arose, the match could proceed. But if someone protested, complications loomed. Consent's measure varied wildly. Did a nod count? A scribbled note? A sign mistaken for agreement? Some priests insisted on public vows before the congregation. Others accepted a hushed promise at the altar. A few, scandalously, turned a blind eye for a bribe. What of coercion? If a girl faced disownment unless she wed, did her yes hold true? If a boy risked losing land without taking a bride, was his consent real? Historians still wrestle with these questions. The church offered answers, but they were slippery, swayed by politics, reputation, or a priest's mood. In some regions, fathers seized control. If a daughter claimed a secret marriage to dodge an arranged one, her father might haul her to court, demanding a reversal. If he won, she faced punishment, banishment to a convent, or a forced marriage. If he lost, the secret groom gained a wife, a dowry, and a lifetime of wary in-law glances. These disputes weren't just noble affairs. Peasant families, too, fretted over alliances, resources, and respectability. A girl claiming a vow without ceremony risked ostracism. A boy who shirked a spoken promise might face a bishop's wrath, ordered to wed or repent. Odd cases cropped up in unexpected corners. A woman claimed her late husband wed her in secret, demanding his inheritance. A man swore he married a girl who vanished, then sought another bride. A servant girl testified her mistress wed the stable boy during Lent. The bishop frowned at the timing but upheld the bond. By the late 1300s, church councils tried to rein in the chaos. They urged priests to record every marriage, ban private vows, and standardize rituals. But enforcement faltered. In remote villages, rules felt distant. In borderlands, they were ignored. Even in cities, love and fear slipped through the cracks. This vagueness left women exposed. A man could claim a clandestine marriage, consummate it, then deny it, leaving her to bear the shame, especially if pregnant. She might appeal to the church, but without proof or favor, her pleas often fell flat. The consequences were hers alone. To shield against this, some families demanded public vows, witnessed by many, sealed with contracts. The more eyes, ears, and signatures, the safer the girl. But not every family could afford such caution. Haste, passion, or desperation sometimes drove couples to private unions, often all they had. Yet, amid this web of confusion and contradiction, something deeply human endured. Couples gazed into each other's eyes, believing their promise held power. They clasped hands, whispering words, trusting the field, trees, or wind as witness. They acted with courage or folly, perhaps both. They believed love, once spoken, could not be undone. These moments didn't always end happily, but they kept happening. In kitchens, gardens, barn corners, they unfolded again and again. Somewhere, a bell tolled, not for a saint or feast, but for a vow no one else heard, yet it changed everything. Heavy black veil rests on her young head, oversized, smelling faintly of lavender and wax, as if worn too long by another. She is 14, already a widow. The ceremony is brief. Words spoken, bread broken, no feast, no music. Only soft prayers hum, and morning shoes creak on wooden floors. Before the month ends, whispers of remarriage will reach her. In the 1300s, widowhood was not a conclusion but a brief pause. Girls wed young, and young husbands fell to war, illness, accident, or malice. The Black Death had not yet struck, but infection, starvation, and broken bones stole lives with ease. A girl could marry at 12, be widowed by 13, and betrothed again before she recalled her first husband's name. Among nobles, this cycle was routine. A young widow retained value, her dowry invested, her fertility assumed, her status defined. Without children, she could be remarried swiftly, free of inheritance tangles. If she bore a son, she might stay as guardian until he matured, then remarry or fade into the household's edges. No one asked her desires. Some widows received a short mourning period, black or gray gowns, a modest allowance, a quiet room near the chapel. They were to weep softly, pray moderately, and remain humble, as if widowhood were a veiled blessing. Others had no time to grieve. If estates needed securing or alliances bolstering, a cousin's eligible brother might claim her before the mourning gown settled. This was not cruelty, it was custom, marching past emotion. Sometimes, remarriage was planned before the burial. A messenger rode out, a letter drafted while the body lay in the chapel. The girl would nod faintly, receiving the news in silence, and start anew. A new name, a new husband, a new home to learn. This wasn't deemed harsh, it was efficient. Rules existed, of course, to preserve appearances. A widow was to mourn for a set time, 40 days in some places, 3 months in others. In lenient homes, it was counted by Sundays, 3 somber church visits in dark attire, then quiet talks of new matches. Among peasants, the pattern echoed, though less formal. A widow might remarry within weeks, driven by children to feed or land to tend. Widowers, especially with young children, sought new wives quickly, needing household help. These unions were practical, sealed over bread and ale, bound by a nod and shared exhaustion. Life paused for no sorrow. Widowhood brought complications. Without heirs, a husband's kin might reclaim property, sending the widow back to her father's house, stripped of linens and status. Or she might stay, wed to a brother or cousin of the deceased, keeping wealth and land under one roof. Historians note widows held a unique place, seen as seasoned, stable, sometimes briefly autonomous. A widow without a husband or son might manage her land, decide for her household, even stand in court. But this freedom was fragile, lasting only until someone stronger stepped in. Some widows chose not to remarry. With a substantial dowry and supportive kin, they could live modestly independent. A few entered convents, not always for faith, but for safety and structure. There, a widow might become a librarian, healer, or teacher, walking unafraid, owning her silence. But most had no such choice. A girl widowed before 15 was told God tested her strength. She was reminded life was fleeting, women were duty's vessels, and honoring her late husband meant smiling for the next. Tears, if shed, were to face the hearth, not the window. Remarriage contracts were swift, often penned by the same notary as the first. If the husband's family owed debts, the widow might be traded to settle them. If her kin sought influence, she'd be paired for political gain. Love and grief stayed outside the discussion. In villages, remarriage could be a simple priestly visit and a vow. The community nodded, noted the shift, and returned to their fields. Sentimentality was scarce. Bread needed baking, lambs needed shelter. Songs spoke of young widows, soft tunes of girls in black. Laughter faded too soon, footsteps that never returned. One verse told of a widow lighting a candle nightly for 7 years. Another saw her cast a ring into a river, walking away barefoot. These were tales, embroidered, yet sung with purpose. Some widows resisted remarriage, growing stubborn, questioning, delaying. One noblewoman postponed her second wedding 6 times, citing omens, dreams, and illness. She relented only for land, 2 horses, and her falcon's freedom, later training them to spurn her new husband's call. Not every widow obeyed. Not every tale ended quietly. Others played their role, but preserved themselves subtly. They kept the first husband's ring in a cloth bag. They left his name on the estate ledger. They sang his lullabies to their children, despite new husbands' frowns. Some found peace in second or third marriages. They wove new rhythms, found quiet joy in work, companionship, or the calm of being left alone. They weren't always happy, but they were steady. In a world of chance, that mattered. Widowhood was no escape, but a reset, a brief step backstage. A chance to change costumes and re-enter the tale with a new name. The girl who once trembled at the altar now stood at another, older, wiser. She knew a marriage's shadows, how to host a feast, soothe a bruise, hold her tongue. She'd lost much, but gained knowledge, a rare feat in a man's world. With squared shoulders and steady face, she stepped into the circle again. A new ring, a new man, the same rights, the same hopes. The future stretched ahead, not radiant, but familiar. In the medieval marriage market, widowhood didn't mean the end. It meant availability anew. In a dim room, shutters closed, a lone beeswax candle flickers by the bread shelf. A girl sits by her mother, legs tucked, fingers fretting a loose thread on her sleeve. Outside, oxen stir in the barn. Inside, her future is whispered into existence. In the countryside, far from grand courts or soaring cathedrals, marriages took shape quietly. No heralds trumpeted these bonds, no stained glass bore their names. They were forged by hearths, under soot-dark rafters, as women shared wisdom and fathers counted hens. The stakes were smaller than noble alliances, but the outcomes just as lasting. A marriage could mean meat in the pot or another winter of onions and hope. Even in the poorest homes, the matter was handled with grave care. Girls rarely spoke during these talks. They listened, watched, learned which words held weight, which silences were tactical. Mothers were the guardians of quiet truths. They knew who in the village had gentle hands, whose father drank too much, which families ignored their sick. They observed, recalled, and guided. When a daughter neared 13 or 14, preparations began, not with grand words, but small signs. A longer apron, hair braided tighter, a sharp glance when a boy loitered too long by the well. Girls were taught to be useful, quiet, clean. But more, they learned to read a room, endure unease, and keep dignity without power. This wasn't called oppression. It was wisdom, strength, practicality. The world was unyielding, so girls learned to bend without breaking. They adapted to its demands with quiet resilience. Their strength was shaped in silence, forged through necessity. Fathers negotiated with practical tools, land, livestock, reputation. A son skilled at thatching was valued over one with a sluggish gait. A daughter who crafted cheese and calmed a bustling home was a treasure, though no one spoke it aloud. A glance at her wrists, her steady stride, or how she swept the floor became a measure of worth. These silent assessments carried weight. When a match seemed promising, families began a delicate courtship dance. It wasn't built on flowers or love letters. Instead, it thrived on loaves of bread passed across doorways. Small gifts were exchanged under watchful eyes, and church pews were chosen with purpose. A boy might escort a girl home from Mass, chatting with her father about the weather. He'd praise the family goat, but everyone knew his true intent. The final decision often rested with the father or the priest, if the family was prudent. A girl might share her hopes with a sister or grandmother in hushed tones. Rarely did she voice them to the men shaping her future. If fortunate, her dreams aligned with the arrangement. If not, she learned to mask disappointment. She hid it behind a bowed head and polite silence. Some villages tested betrothals with informal trials, watching the couple for harmony. These could last months, though the pressure to commit always lingered. A broken engagement could tarnish a girl's prospects. It cast shadows on her character, health, or value. Once the match was sealed, preparations began in earnest. No silken trousseau or costly jewels adorned these brides. Practical items were gathered: blankets, a simple comb, sturdy wooden bowls. Mothers offered advice, sometimes sharp, sometimes tender. One village woman handed her daughter a bundle of herbs. She said they were for fevers, for bleeding, for when silence grew too heavy. The wedding itself was humble, a priest's blessing, a shared loaf, a cup of cider. Some couples marked the moment with hand fasting. Their wrists were bound with ribbon or cloth, a symbol of unity. Others simply spoke their vows aloud before family and neighbors. Gifts were modest: a pie, a knitted scarf, an extra hour of help with the cows. Rural weddings often followed the seasons, timed with harvests or planting. Spring unions allowed new households to settle before winter's bite. Autumn weddings rode the wave of full granaries and village goodwill. Winter ceremonies were rare, held only when urgency demanded. Once wed, the bride joined her husband's home, often crowded with parents, siblings, and a maze of aunts and cousins. Privacy was scarce, and respect was hard-earned. She was expected to learn quickly, defer wisely, and prove her worth through skill, not charm. Life wasn't cruel, but it was unrelenting. Chores began before dawn, followed by disputes, illness, and aching backs. Yet, amid the toil, kindness bloomed in small moments. A second helping of soup, a hand on the shoulder, new wool stockings when the old ones wore through. Not every village marriage was arranged. Some sprang from affection, children who grew up side by side, harvesting together, whispering by the well. Even then, a smile wasn't enough. Permission was required. A promise needed blessing, witnesses, and security. The rules held firm, even when hearts were tender. In quiet homes, lit by oil lamps and warmed by stubborn fires, women became wives. They stood beside men they barely knew or knew too well. They stirred soup, made beds, bore children, and brokered peace. They endured, adapted, and shared hard-earned wisdom with their daughters. The cycle spun onward, generation after generation. In these villages, love wasn't a guarantee, it was a faint possibility. It arrived slowly, often unnoticed, in fleeting moments. A shared laugh, a hand held just a moment too long. A joke told once, just for her, carried quiet weight. These moments didn't reshape the world, but they mattered deeply. In candlelit homes, free of titles or treaties, marriage was more than a market. It was a delicate balance between need and hope. It wove habit with tenderness, duty with what might ease the burden. Late at night, the hearth cold, a girl's boots were missing. Her father paced, jaw tight, while her mother stared into the dark beyond the window. She stood as if the wind might carry her daughter back. A knock came, a neighbor, breathless, voice low and urgent. The girl was gone. She had fled. In the medieval world, scandal didn't always roar. It slipped out quietly, in borrowed shoes. Elopements weren't common, but they weren't rare. Despite customs, contracts, and church oversight, some chose flight over surrender. They ran not from hatred of tradition, but from desperation, fear, or fears, impossible love. They didn't always escape far, nor always succeed, but they ran. Reasons varied. A girl betrothed to a man she dreaded. A boy facing a future scripted by another's hand. Friends who shared too many secrets, realizing marriage was their only shield. They slipped through society's cracks, riding at dawn, hiding in barns. They bribed ferrymen or fled to parishes where names could blur or shift. Some found a kind priest, willing to rush a ceremony for coin, silence, or shared wine. If discovered, these unions could sometimes be upheld. The church valued order, but also the sanctity of vows, especially if consummated. Once flesh met flesh, the matter grew complex. Families, however, rarely saw it so. A girl who fled could unravel years of careful negotiation. Dowries might be lost, alliances broken, reputations shattered. A father might send servants or kin to drag her back. If the boy was caught, he faced beatings, imprisonment, or worse, depending on their stations. A returned girl might be locked away, shunned, or wed off swiftly to prevent another flight. In 1324, a miller's daughter fled with a passing soldier. 3 days later, they were caught. He was whipped and discharged. She sent to an aunt's village. There, she married a shoemaker and never spoke of the soldier again. Her tale became legend. Not warning, people whispered, she ran once. Don't underestimate her. Among nobles, elopements could ripple through kingdoms. A noblewoman marrying beneath her rank risked duels, chaos, or war. Royal consent was often required for highborn unions, defying it was near treason. One baron's daughter fell for her tutor, fleeing under night's cover with forged papers. They lived in secret for nearly a year before discovery. The tutor was executed. She was confined to a convent. Her father donated land to hush the scandal, and she spent her life copying texts, her handwriting steady but tinged with sorrow. Not all elopements ended in ruin. Some couples found refuge in welcoming towns, building quiet lives. Their children grew unaware of the peril their parents once faced. These tales, though rare, linger in letter margins and songs passed by word of mouth. They echo in families proud of ancestors who loved with boldness. Elopement wasn't always rebellion. Sometimes, it was the only path left. A girl pregnant out of wedlock might flee to the boy, desperate to turn shame into legitimacy. A widower might wed a servant in secret to dodge scandal. A poor couple, lacking family support, might marry quietly to avoid separation. These unions weren't always romantic, often practical, driven by urgency. Yet, even in haste, tenderness found space. A half-melted candle on a borrowed altar, a groom's nervous laugh as he fumbled his lines. A new name scrawled in a church ledger, ink smudged by trembling hands. These moments, unplanned and unsanctioned, were lived deeply. Communities reacted variably to elopements. Some looked away. A baker left an extra loaf. A shepherd misplaced barn keys. A priest might cough and turn aside, not defiance but mercy. Life was hard, love rare. Bending rules could be kindness. Others judged harshly. A girl returning from a failed elopement found her name whispered warily. Her presence at gatherings was quietly shunned. A boy returning alone might face mockery, blows, or banishment. The social toll was steep, paid in respectability. Some elopements were false, stories spun to cloak scandal. A girl vanished, but truly was sent away in disgrace. A boy disappeared, claimed by illness or exile. Elopement became the softer tale, romantic rather than shameful. Poems, scratched anonymously in parchment margins, sing of lovers on the run. One begins, "We met beneath the elder tree, and I gave you a name the world wouldn't hear." Another ends with a vow carved in wood. "If we don't reach the chapel, we reached each other." Historians debate elopement's frequency and impact. Some call it a rare, reckless outlier. Others argue it was more common, hidden beneath silence, shame, and survival. What's certain is the urge to escape, to seize love or choice, never faded. Elopement stood outside marriage's careful bounds. It wasn't arranged, negotiated, or pre-blessed, but it was real. For those who lived it, even briefly, it was unforgettable. In a world where girls were matched like barrels of wine and boys weighed by inherited fields, elopement was rebellion's whisper. It was the candle lit behind the chapel, boots by the door, a ribbon on the riverbank. They knew the cost and ran anyway. They knew the odds and vowed anyway. Whether they reached the priest or not, whether their tale ended in union or silence, they left a mark. Not in scrolls or stained glass, but in the shared memory of a world that feared love. It feared it precisely because it could not always be contained. Love could not always be tamed in the medieval marriage market. Every role was assigned, every path scripted, except for those who fled. Their defiance carved a space where rules faltered. The ship sways gently beneath her feet as she grips the railing. Her knuckles blanch against the morning mist, eyes locked on an unfamiliar shore. Her hair is tightly braided, her gown meticulously arranged, her face a mask of calm. She doesn't speak the tongue of the men who brought her here. The woman waiting on the dock is a stranger, nameless to her. She knows only that her own name has been traded, her world swapped for another. In the 13th and 14th centuries, marriage stretched beyond village borders. It spanned rivers, fields, and often entire seas. Foreign unions between noble houses, kingdoms, duchies, provinces were potent diplomatic tools. A girl could halt a war, cement an alliance, or open a trade route. All she had to do was leave behind everything she knew. For noble families, sending a daughter abroad wasn't abandonment, it was strategy. Her dowry was vast, her entourage carefully selected. Her actions were rehearsed long before departure. She carried her family's honor, her homeland's faith, her lineage's weight. In return, she was to learn swiftly, adapt silently, and bear heirs efficiently. The challenges were daunting. A girl sent from England to Castile or Brittany to Bohemia often arrived tongue-tied. Unfamiliar customs marked her as foreign. Her braids, her garments, even her posture set her apart. She moved to a different rhythm, knelt at the wrong moments, missed the humor in local jests. Integration was neither swift nor gentle. Servants whispered, courtiers scrutinized, cooks grumbled she shunned their dishes. Her accent drew mockery, her curtsies correction, her solitary walks reproof. It was a trial, and she was expected to pass. Historians tell of noble brides who wept in secret for weeks. They were barred from riding home until they proved their worth. Others fell under the stern gaze of widowed matrons. These sharp-tongued guardians molded the bride for court life. They offered no comfort, only swift commands. The transformation began at once. New wardrobe, new name, new braids. Her native tongue was confined to private moments, if permitted at all. She learned what to eat, how to sit, which saints to call upon. She mastered her husband's family name, pronouncing it without faltering. Hesitation was weakness, and weakness was unforgivable. If her faith differed from her new home's, the struggle deepened. A Catholic girl in a newly Orthodox household, or vice versa, faced pressure to convert. At minimum, she adapted to local rites. Even among Christians, clashing saint calendars or feast customs sparked tension. Some disputes simmered for years. A Flemish noblewoman, sent to a Hungarian court, wrote of enduring daily boiled cabbage. She feigned delight while yearning for her dog, her brother, her home church's bells. She signed her letter with a new name but scrawled in the margin, she still dreamed in her old one. Not all foreign brides suffered in silence. Some wielded their difference as strength. A bride's foreign knowledge could sway trade deals. Fluency in languages made her a translator. Mastery of alien customs let her guide etiquette or forge alliances. Rarely, foreign brides rose as court luminaries, diplomats, educators, patrons. But these were outliers. More often, the girl was diminished. Her name reshaped, her past softened. Her accent was drilled away, her homeland spoken of only in past tense. Dangers lurked. A foreign bride had no natural allies. Her new kin might eye her with distrust. Failure to bear children swiftly could brand her a bearer of ill luck, or worse, foreign sorcery. In famine or unrest, foreign wives were easy targets. One Navarre queen was blamed for a poor harvest for wearing green on a holy day. Another faced witchcraft accusations for spurning eel. Among commoners, foreign marriages occurred too, though smaller in scope. Merchants' daughters wed men from distant ports. Traders met women at fairs or pilgrimages, bringing them home as wives. Language gaps were bridged with patience, gestures, and the unspoken grammar of need. These unions were often steeped in long silences. Couples learned each other slowly, through shared tasks, frustration, and the quiet relief of sleep side by side. No priest clarified, no tutor translated. Only work's rhythm, children's laughter, and trust built in strange rooms sustained them. Adaptation was less about ceremony, more about survival. A foreign bride rose before dawn to master the kitchen's firestones. She learned livestock names before her in-laws. She wept alone, but smiled when addressed. Her husband might be kind, or not, but the burden of adjustment was hers. Some found unexpected kindness, a patient spouse, a servant's guidance, a neighbor's aid without judgment. These moments shaped endless days of confusion and nights of homesickness. Yet, even in kindest cases, a girl sent abroad bore exile's weight. She smiled without grasping the jest, memorized unpronounceable names, studied rituals she didn't believe. She shaped herself to fit, just enough. For those who bore children, the change ran deeper. Their sons spoke a tongue not her own. Their daughters sang foreign lullabies. Her old life faded. The girl who boarded the ship now rooted in alien soil. Still, traces lingered, a ribbon in a wooden box, a native phrase whispered before sleep. A recipe cooked yearly, though no one savored it. These fragments weren't rebellion, they were memory. Even noble courts, obsessed with assimilation, couldn't erase the homes held in quiet hearts. An Aquitaine duchess planted lavender everywhere she lived. A Scottish noblewoman painted her chambers in homeland hues. A Polish princess brought a dog whose bark puzzled all, but was fiercely guarded. Foreignness didn't vanish. It softened, hid in corners, but endured. In grand halls, behind laughter and pomp, girls still adjusted to unfamiliar bells. Women prayed the Lord's Prayer in dual tongues. Mothers taught sons, "I love you," in a language no one else in the house knew. In the medieval marriage market, a foreign bride was more than a girl. She was a symbol, a solution, a tale rewritten in another's ink. Though she might never return home, though her voice and name changed, she remembered who she was. If only in silence, if only in dreams. A door creaks open, and a man enters, followed by his brother, his mother, and a woman with a lamp. The girl stands still, hands clasped, eyes lowered. They've come to inspect her, not her mind or spirit, but her body. Her teeth, hips, hair, and fertility are under scrutiny. In this moment, she's not a person but a prospect. In the medieval marriage market, appearance wasn't mere vanity, it was proof. A girl's worth hinged on embodying what families deemed a wife and mother should be. Before vows, feasts, or priests came the quiet evaluation. More common among the wealthy, it wasn't absent among commoners. A girl's looks were her credentials. Pale skin suggested she didn't toil in fields. Strong teeth hinted at surviving childbirth. Wide hips promised sons. Thick hair was a boon, soft hands a prize. Silence when prodded was essential. These judgments often went unspoken, cloaked in casual remarks. She seems healthy, someone might murmur. Her cheeks have good color, another might note. Or, bluntly, her mother bore 7 and lost none. A compliment, perhaps, but always a measurement. Among nobles, inspections were overt. A bride might be asked to walk a hall's length, sing, smile, or sit beside her future mother-in-law. Her posture was studied, her every gesture weighed. Her laugh might be noted, her hair gently touched, and in some cases, a physician or midwife would be quietly summoned. Do you see strength in her form? Do her hips look promising? The girl, raised from childhood to be quiet and compliant, would obey. She wouldn't ask why. She already knew. Historians record several instances where noble brides were rejected after such evaluations. One girl walked with a slight limp from a childhood injury. Another had teeth described as not pleasing. One simply reminded the groom's uncle of a woman he once disliked. Absurd, by any humane measure. Yet those were reasons enough. A single imperfection could unravel years of diplomatic planning. Scattered records speak of even more theatrical assessments. An Italian merchant reportedly demanded that his future daughter-in-law be weighed, besides sacks of grain. A German countess insisted her prospective daughter-in-law spend an entire day in the estate kitchens, just to test her endurance. A French nobleman went so far as to ask his banquet guests to rate the bride's appearance, later claiming it was all a joke. She never smiled again. Among peasants, the inspections were more grounded, more practical. Was the girl strong enough to lift a full bucket of water? Could she tend a fire, knead dough, carry a child on her hip while plucking chickens? These questions were rarely asked directly. They were answered through observation. A neighbor might be discreetly consulted. A local healer might be invited over for a drink, then asked quietly for her opinion. And always, the teeth. Teeth were a peculiar obsession. Clean, even teeth suggested vitality. Good nutrition, strong roots, potential for survival. Bad teeth hinted at decay, laziness, or poor lineage. There are documented cases of girls being told to open their mouths during marriage negotiations. A little torchlight, a quick glance, a judgment delivered with a shrug, as if appraising livestock. This wasn't considered cruel. It was considered practical. Virginity, of course, played a role, though it couldn't be confirmed with the eye. Families claimed they could sense it through the girl's speech, her shyness, her posture. Girls were taught to walk slowly, to blush easily, to avoid confidence, lest it be mistaken for impropriety. Too much poise raised eyebrows. Too much knowledge, even of ordinary tasks, could be twisted into accusation. A girl who spoke clearly about men might be labeled immodest. A girl who said nothing at all would be praised for her innocence. The contradictions were endless. A bride must be strong, but not overly muscular. Graceful, but not vain. Fertile, but not forward. Soft-spoken, but not dim. She was expected to be a blank canvas, ready for the marriage to write its expectations across her skin. Sometimes the girl passed the inspection. Sometimes she didn't. In both cases, she was not invited to share her thoughts, only her presence. For those who failed to meet these unspoken standards, life narrowed quickly. The engagement might collapse. Negotiations paused. Whispers began. She is too plain. She walks too quickly. She didn't smile at the priest. These were not scandals. They were shadows, sufficient to darken her future. Even girls deemed beautiful were not safe. Beauty itself posed a danger. Too much of it attracted suspicion. Or worse, competition. A bride admired by too many could be accused of vanity, of flirtation, even of sorcery. One girl was sent away after a group of young men fought over her at the market. Her family called it bad luck. The priest called it a curse. And yet beauty retained value. It was a currency. A girl with striking eyes or golden hair might draw more offers. Her dowry might even be slightly reduced. Her parents might boast just a little louder. She, in turn, learned to wield it. A smile for the appropriate guest. Averted eyes at the proper time. A gentle laugh practiced, until it sounded spontaneous. What no one told her was that the inspection never truly ended. Even after marriage, the evaluations continued. Was she thriving or fading? Did her skin still glow with youthful promise? Did she move with the grace expected of a proper wife? And when children came, or didn't, Her body once again became the evidence. If she bore sons, her beauty was declared prophetic. If not, blame quickly followed. Perhaps she was never as strong as she appeared. Perhaps her mother overfed her. There was no escaping the gaze, only learning how to adapt beneath it. Some women found quiet ways to reclaim it. One noble bride, upon being told her teeth were acceptable, grinned broadly and replied, "Then I shall bite only on feast days." Another wore layers to hide her shape during inspection, then revealed her actual strength by outrunning her suitor in a foot race across the orchard. She won, and the match was sealed with laughter and ale. But most did not rebel. They let themselves be examined, weighed, compared. They turned their faces toward the light, and silently hoped that their cheekbones might shift the course of fate. For in the medieval marriage market, it was not her mind that mattered most. It was the shape of her face, the width of her hips, the whiteness of her teeth. Her body was the dowry before the dowry, an unspoken contract signed with every look. And whether the girl smiled or remained still, the inspection was already underway. The barn smells of hay and smoke. It is early morning. The frost still clings to the beams. A girl, no longer quite a girl, yet not entirely a woman, is already awake. She stirs a pot above the fire, folds garments still warm from the embers, and quietly watches as a cradle rocks softly in the corner. Her husband is still asleep. Outside, a rooster calls the world to begin again. Inside, she is already awake, already living the life the wedding quietly promised. In many medieval homes, marriage did not arrive with gentle transitions. The ceremony might be short, the feast might end quickly, but the expectations that followed arrived swiftly, and without warning. A girl became a wife the moment she stepped across her husband's threshold. She became a mother the moment her body allowed it. And from that point forward, she remained both. Relentlessly, the pressure of childbirth loomed immediately. A girl married at 14 was expected to carry a child by 15, or sooner, if possible. Fertility was not just a gift, it was evidence. A home without children was seen as a home without future. A womb that failed to produce life became a source of concern, of whispered pity, fervent prayer, and, at times, quiet replacement. No one asked how she felt about it. They asked whether she had bled yet this month. If not, the midwife would be called. A candle would be lit, a cup of broth prepared, and all eyes would turn to her abdomen, as if watching for it to speak. Sometimes, it answered without words. Pregnancy wasn't framed as joy. It was duty. To the family, the estate, the village, and to God. Girls were taught to expect pain, to accept risk, to remain silent. If a woman screamed too loudly during birth, she was suspected of weakness or sin. If she died, it was mourned, but expected, and many did. Childbirth in the 1300s was dangerous. Midwives did what they could, with boiled water, with herbs, with knowledge passed down through generations. But infections took hold. Blood loss was common. Breech births, deadly. The death of a child was mourned briefly, then followed by renewed efforts. A wife was expected to give birth as many times as her body allowed. Sons were praised. Daughters meant she must try again. There was little time to heal. A woman who delivered was expected to return to her duties within days. Faster, if the household was poor. Babies were swaddled and placed near the fire. Mothers returned to churning butter, fetching water, tending livestock, and whispering prayers. Marriage and motherhood were not separate identities. They were woven together, inseparable, indistinguishable. A wife who could not mother was considered lacking. A mother who could not serve her household was seen as selfish. Some girls adapted to the rhythm. They found peace in repetition, a kind of purpose in daily tasks. Others felt themselves slowly dissolving, the weight of expectation growing heavier. With each passing child, each harsh winter, each night when the baby's cough kept growing louder, there were no diaries, no healers of the soul, no time to question what she had lost. Only survival, only the daily churn, only the slow erosion of the self she once believed she might become. And yet, softness persisted. A hand held beneath the table, a sleeping child's breath brushing against her neck. The stillness after prayer, when the fire's soft cracking felt like company. A neighbor's gift of bread, a story passed from an elder to a young mother. A reminder that others had walked this path, that they had found flickers of light along the way. There were celebrations, too. A child's first steps, A harvest shared. The day her husband came home early from the market and kissed her. For no reason at all. These were not grand, cinematic moments. They were measured in inches. But inches mattered. The girl who once wore a crown of herbs now wrapped her hair with a cloth against the cold. Her hands bore the marks of labor. Her voice grew steadier, lower. Her eyes no longer widened at every new task. They stayed firm. She knew the weight of grain, the stretch of dough, the cries of colic before they came. She was no longer under inspection. She was relied upon. But still, the pressure did not fade. If her husband died, she became a widow. If he lived, she remained a wife. If she bore too many, her strength faded. If she bore none, her value was quietly questioned. Every path demanded something. None offered rest. Girls were often wed before the harvest. It gave them time to learn how to tend fire before winter arrived. By the time the first frost came, she was expected to know how to keep stew from spoiling, how to warm the baby, how to preserve the flame. No one explained this. It was demonstrated, implied, expected. She remembered her wedding not for its celebration, but for its ending, for the way she walked into a house that was not hers, with a man she barely knew, and how she told herself she would make it hers, that she would find something to hold on to, a recipe, a corner, a private victory. She learned how to read his silences, and in time, she did. Marriage, for most girls, was not a moment. It was a process of letting go of the life they imagined and learning to hold what it became. She never asked whether it was fair, only whether the stew was hot enough, whether the child would sleep through the night, whether the morning sun would be warm enough to wash clothes in the yard. Because in the medieval marriage market, a girl's journey did not end at the altar. It began at dawn, and began again, every single day. And so, she rose. The cradle rocks gently. The fire is now embers. The air is still, and beyond the window, the sky softens into that quiet shade of gray. The color between things, between night and morning, between silence and birdsong, between everything that has already happened and everything that still might. You have walked far tonight. From noble halls to smoke-darkened kitchens, from cold chapels to windswept docks. You've stood beside daughters wrapped in velvet, and girls in aprons smudged with flour. You've watched ribbons tied, vows whispered, futures sealed, not with kisses, but with livestock and land, with worry, with hope, with whispered prayers. You've seen girls aged 12 measured for motherhood, girls of 14 dressed for mourning, then marriage again. You've heard shoes exchanged like promises, portraits kissed before names were known. You've watched girls leave behind their language, trading familiar hills for foreign roofs. You've seen them learn when to bow, when to speak, and when to say absolutely nothing. And through it all, beneath the rituals, the scrutiny, the obedience, you've glimpsed something softer. A glance stolen, a dish stirred the way her mother taught her, a lullaby hummed in a language her children would never understand. But she could never forget, because even in a world that treated girls like parchment waiting for a signature, they found ways to remember, to survive, to exist. And tonight, maybe you remember something too. How far we have come, and how far we still must go. You remember that behind every faded name in a ledger, there was a girl, with cold feet, and a heart that was beating. That behind every marriage contract, there was a moment of silence, where someone held their breath, and waited to see what came next. And now, so do you. You don't need to remember every duchy, every date, every ritual. Just hold the shape of the story, the rhythm of repetition, the sound of wool brushing against stone. As a girl walks toward a doorway she cannot yet see through, because the past does not shout, it only needs to whisper. So let the story quiet itself now. Let the footsteps soften. Let the ribbons fall. Let the hearth grow low. The girl is asleep now. The vows have been said. The baby breathes steadily in the cradle. The candles have burned down. The stew has cooled. There is nothing more to prepare. You may rest now, too. You are not being measured. You are not being matched. You are not being watched. Only held. Just for a little while. Until morning.